the city lights died all at once. Sarah Chen was mid-sentence during her Zoom presentation when her laptop screen went black. Around her, the entire Manhattan skyline, a constellation of glass towers that had never known darkness, plunged into an abyss of silence. Car horns stopped mid-blare as engines died on the FDR drive below. Emergency sirens wound down like dying animals. In apartments across the city, millions of people stared at dead phones, silent televisions, cold refrigerators. The electromagnetic pulse had been invisible, but its aftermath was a scream of absence. No hum of electricity, no digital chatter, no connection to the world beyond their windows. Within minutes, panic erupted in the streets. People poured from buildings, shouting into useless devices, demanding answers no one could provide. But 72 miles north in rural New York, in a small farmhouse where time seemed to move differently, Walter Kowalski wasn't panicking. While the rest of the world discovered the terrifying silence of a dead grid, Walter calmly walked to his basement workshop. Past the modern world's judgment, past neighbors who'd called him paranoid, and grandchildren who'd rolled their eyes at his ancient junk, he approached a wooden table covered by a canvas tarp. He pulled away the cloth, revealing what everyone had dismissed as an old man's silly hobby. A gleaming brass telegraph key connected to a crystal radio, tubes glowing warm in the darkness like fireflies in a cave. Walter's weathered fingers found the familiar metal lever, and in the deafening silence that had swallowed the world, he began to tap. Dit-dut-it, dit-dut-it, dit-dut-it. 3 deliberate S's in Morse code. The international distress signal that had saved lives long before smartphones existed. And somewhere in the electromagnetic wasteland of a broken world, Walter Kowalski was about to discover he wasn't as alone as everyone thought. Walter's fingers moved with muscle memory forged 60 years ago aboard the USS Constellation, when he was 19 and responsible for maintaining radio contact between his destroyer and the fleet during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back then, when nuclear war felt like a heartbeat away, Morse code wasn't a hobby, it was the thin line between civilization and chaos. He'd never told his family about the night in October 1962 when Soviet submarines nearly launched nuclear torpedoes, and only frantic telegraph messages between commanders had prevented World War III. His wife Martha had known something haunted him from those Navy days, but Walter kept the weight of almost apocalypse buried beneath decades of suburban normalcy. After Martha's death 3 years ago, their son David had suggested selling the farmhouse. "Dad, you're 82. This place is too big, and frankly, all that radio equipment in the basement is just taking up space. Nobody uses that stuff anymore." David worked in cybersecurity in Boston, designing firewalls and encryption protocols that had just become completely useless. Walter's granddaughter Emma, a sophomore at NYU studying digital media, had been even more blunt during Christmas dinner. "Grandpa, why do you waste time with that old telegraph thing? We have smartphones now. We can talk to anyone, anywhere, instantly." She'd live-streamed herself mocking his Museum of Ancient Technology to her 50,000 TikTok followers. But Walter had persisted, maintaining his amateur radio license, practicing Morse code every evening, keeping vacuum tubes in working order. His neighbors in the rural community thought he was eccentric at best, mentally declining at worst. The local newspaper had even done a quirky feature on him titled, "The Last Telegraph Operator," treating him like a living relic. Now, as his fingers worked the brass key, Walter remembered why he'd never let it go. During Hurricane Sandy in 2012, when cell towers failed and the power grid collapsed across the Northeast, amateur radio operators had been the only link between isolated communities and rescue services. When the 9/11 attacks overwhelmed all conventional communication systems, ham radio operators had provided crucial coordination for first responders. But this was different. This wasn't a regional disaster, this was total electromagnetic collapse. And as Walter sent his distress signal into the void, he wondered if anyone else had maintained the old ways. Hey, before we continue, drop a comment and let us know what state or country you're watching from. We're curious how far this story is reaching. 3 sharp taps on his farmhouse door interrupted his transmission. Outside stood his neighbor, Jim Bradley, the same man who'd called Walter's radio setup a fire hazard at the last town meeting. Jim's face was pale, his usual smugness replaced by something Walter recognized from his Navy days. The look of a man who'd suddenly realized how unprepared he was for the unthinkable. "Walter," Jim's voice cracked. "My daughter lives in Buffalo. I can't reach her. My car won't start. Nothing works. Do you know what's happening?" Walter studied Jim's terrified face through the doorframe. 6 months ago, this same man had filed a complaint with the county about Walter's unsightly antenna array and pushed for an HOA that would ban amateur radio equipment. Now Jim stood on Walter's porch, hat literally in hand. "MP," Walter said simply. "Electromagnetic pulse. Could be solar, could be..." He didn't finish the sentence. The alternative, a high-altitude nuclear detonation, was too terrifying to voice aloud. Within an hour, Walter's farmhouse had become an unlikely command center. Jim brought his wife Carol and teenage son Tyler. Mrs. Henderson from 3 houses down arrived with her diabetic husband, whose insulin was warming in their dead refrigerator. The Yamamoto family from the corner lot came carrying their elderly grandmother, who spoke limited English but whose eyes held the recognition of someone who'd survived catastrophe before. Tyler Bradley, 17 and suddenly cut off from his digital world, initially sulked in the corner. He'd been live streaming a gaming session when everything died, losing not just his connection but his entire identity as an online influencer. "This is pointless," he muttered when Walter tried to explain Morse code. "Nobody knows this garbage anymore. We need real solutions." But as Walter's radio crackled to life with distant voices, fragmented emergency transmissions from across the continent, Tyler's hostility slowly transformed into fascination. Walter was making contact with a network of operators from rural Idaho to backwoods Maine, creating an information web that spanned thousands of miles. The first betrayal came from an unexpected source. Carol Bradley, desperate to contact her sister in Philadelphia, had secretly been telling other neighbors that Walter was hoarding communication capabilities, while their families remained lost. By the 3rd day, nearly 30 people had crowded into Walter's basement, all demanding he contact their relatives, their workplaces, their entire disrupted lives. The tension exploded when Frank Kowalski, Walter's own brother from Albany, arrived unannounced with his family and 2 loaded shotguns. Frank had always resented Walter's military service and what he called his brother's survivalist paranoia. Now Frank wanted to take control of the radio network, believing Walter was too old and too soft to manage such a critical resource. "You're rationing information like it's gold, Walt," Frank accused, his hand resting on his weapon. "People need to know what's happening to their families. Stop playing games with that damn ticker-tapper and let me handle communications." The confrontation reached its breaking point when Frank's teenage son Jason, trying to modernize Walter's setup, accidentally knocked over a vacuum tube amplifier. The crash of breaking glass silenced the room. Walter stared at the shattered components, irreplaceable relics that couldn't be manufactured without functioning factories, and something cold settled in his chest. Tyler Bradley surprised everyone by stepping forward. "You idiots don't understand," he said, his usual teenage snark replaced by genuine anger. "Mr. Kowalski isn't hoarding anything. He's the only reason we know Boston is still standing, that the government is trying to coordinate from Colorado, that rescue operations are being planned. You want to break the one thing that's working. Quick favor, if this story is keeping you hooked, hit that subscribe button and give us a like. We're pushing hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every bit of support helps us bring you more content like this." The room divided into factions. Frank's aggressive faction demanding control, Tyler's growing group of younger residents who'd begun learning Morse code basics, and a frightened middle group just wanting their old lives back. But Walter's biggest shock came when Mrs. Yamamoto's grandmother, who'd remained silent for days, approached his radio setup and tapped out a perfect message in International Morse. "Hiroshima survivor. I remember when the old ways saved us. How can I help?" The crisis reached its peak on the 7th day when 8-year-old Sophie Henderson collapsed with diabetic ketoacidosis. Her grandfather's insulin had spoiled days ago, and without modern medical monitoring, her blood sugar had spiraled into a life-threatening coma. Her breathing became labored, shallow gasps that echoed through Walter's farmhouse like a countdown timer. Patricia Reeves, a retired pediatrician who joined their group, knelt beside the unconscious child with tears in her eyes. She needs insulin and 4 fluids immediately, or she'll die within hours. But the nearest hospital is 60 miles away, and even if we could get there... She gestured helplessly at the dead vehicles lining the street. Frank Kowalski seized the moment. "This is exactly what I've been talking about," he shouted, waving his shotgun toward Walter's radio setup. "We're playing around with ancient nonsense while this child dies. We need to take a working car, forcibly if necessary, and drive to Albany Medical Center." "With what car?" Tyler Bradley shot back. "Every vehicle manufactured after 1970 is fried. The EMP killed every electronic ignition system, every fuel pump, Then we'll find an old one." Frank's voice cracked with desperation. "We'll break into that vintage car museum in Cooperstown. We'll steal, we'll fight, whatever it takes." But Walter had already made his decision. While the others argued, he'd been sending coded messages through his network, searching for any medical facilities still operating on emergency power. His fingers flew across the telegraph key with urgent precision, reaching out to amateur radio operators across the Northeast. Then it happened, a weak signal from Vermont. "Dit-dit-dit. I've got something," Walter announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. The room fell silent except for Sophie's labored breathing. "There's a field hospital operating near Rutland, Vermont. They have insulin and medical supplies. But..." He paused, calculating distances and time. "It's 140 miles north." "Impossible, duh," Reeves whispered. "Even if we had transportation, she wouldn't survive the journey." Walter's weathered face set into grim determination. "Not by road. By air." He turned to the assembled group. Bobby Henwick's got a 1965 Cessna 172 at the county airfield. Pre-electronic ignition, magneto-based engine. It should still fly. Frank laughed bitterly. "Bobby's been dead for 2 years, Walt. And none of us are pilots." "I am." The voice came from an unexpected source, Mrs. Yamamoto's grandmother, speaking in accented but clear English. "Michiko Tanaka. I flew supply runs in the Pacific after the war, before I married and came to America. If the airplane works..." The desperate journey to the airfield became a race against time and human nature. Frank's faction tried to stop them, insisting it was suicide. Others demanded to come along, overloading the small aircraft. Tyler Bradley made the critical decision, standing between Frank and the airplane hangar with nothing but a crowbar and teenage determination. "You want to stop us?" Tyler challenged his own father's brother. "Then shoot me. Because I'm not letting Sophie die while you argue about who's in charge." The hangar doors opened to reveal Bobby's pristine Cessna, looking like a time capsule from aviation's golden age. Michiko Tanaka, all of 86 years old, ran her hands over the controls with the confidence of someone who'd flown when flying was still dangerous magic. Walter crouched beside Sophie's unconscious form in the back seat, his portable radio crackling with coordinates from the Vermont medical team. As the propellers spun to life, a sound that seemed impossible in their electronic graveyard, he tapped out one final message to his amateur radio network: "Angel flight departing. Pray for tailwinds." The Cessna lifted into gray skies above a dark landscape, carrying 3 unlikely heroes toward a desperate gamble. Below them, a world without electricity stretched endlessly, but ahead, somewhere in the electromagnetic silence, hope still transmitted on frequencies the modern world had forgotten. The flight to Vermont became the stuff of legend among the surviving amateur radio network. Michiko Tanaka, whose hands hadn't touched aircraft controls in 30 years, navigated by Dead Reckoning and Walter's radio contacts, following a chain of ham operators who guided them through weather and terrain using nothing but Morse code and voice reports. Sophie Henderson survived. The field hospital in Rutland had insulin reserves and managed to stabilize her condition, but the real miracle came in the weeks that followed. Word of the successful rescue mission spread through the amateur radio network like wildfire, inspiring isolated communities across the continent. Suddenly, The obsolete knowledge that Walter and a few thousand other radio operators had preserved became the backbone of a new communication system. Tyler Bradley, the teenager who'd mocked his grandfather's ancient technology just weeks before, became Walter's most dedicated student. He spent hours learning not just Morse code, but the deeper principles of electronics, radio propagation, and emergency communication protocols. "I thought being connected meant having 5 bars on your phone," Tyler admitted one evening as they practiced transmissions. "I never understood that real connection is about understanding how things actually work." The transformation wasn't without casualties. Frank Kowalski left with his family after the flight incident, unable to accept that his brother's paranoid hobbies had proved more valuable than his own aggressive pragmatism. "You got lucky, Walt," were his parting words. But when the real trouble starts, when food runs out and people get desperate, your little radio club won't save you. He was wrong, but not in the way anyone expected. 3 months after the EMP, when autumn temperatures began dropping and supply shortages reached critical levels, Walter's network had evolved into something unprecedented, a continent-spanning coordination system for mutual aid. Amateur radio operators weren't just passing messages, they were organizing supply convoys, coordinating medical evacuations, and sharing crucial survival knowledge. Mrs. Yamamoto's grandmother, Michiko, revealed the full depth of her story during those long winter evenings. She hadn't just flown supply runs after World War II, she'd been part of the covert operation to evacuate Allied prisoners from Japanese camps, using primitive radio equipment to coordinate with guerrilla forces. "Technology changes," she told Walter as they maintained their nightly radio schedule. "But the need to reach across the darkness, to find other human voices, that never changes." Patricia Reeves established the first post-EMP medical training program, using Walter's radio network to share emergency procedures with isolated communities. She'd realized that modern medicine's reliance on electronic systems had created a dangerous vulnerability. "We trained doctors to depend on machines for everything," she explained during one of her radio broadcasts. Walter's generation knew how to improvise, how to solve problems with their hands and minds instead of computers. The most profound transformation belonged to the community itself. People who'd lived as strangers in adjacent houses for decades discovered they needed each other in ways modern life had obscured. The Hendersons, whose daughter Walter had helped save, became the unofficial coordinators for local food distribution. Jim Bradley, who'd initially resented Walter's radio equipment, learned carpentry skills that proved invaluable for winterizing homes without electric heating. But the real revelation came during the first anniversary of the EMP, when Tyler Bradley made contact with a group of survivors in Japan. The conversation, conducted entirely in Morse code across the Pacific, revealed that isolated communities worldwide had maintained similar networks. The obsolete skills that modern society had nearly discarded were quietly threading the broken world back together. Walter received a message that changed everything he thought he knew about his own past. The transmission came from Alaska, from a retired Navy radio man named Chen Weiming who'd served on a different destroyer during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Chen's message was simple but devastating. "Walt, the October '62 incident. We weren't alone that night. Amateur operators worldwide were listening, ready to spread word if diplomatic channels failed. Your old skill saved more than you knew." The weight of that revelation, that his hobby had been part of a hidden safety net for humanity, brought Walter to his knees in his basement workshop. For 60 years, he'd carried the guilt of almost apocalypse, never knowing that civilians like him had been quietly standing guard, ready to maintain human communication if the official channels failed. Tyler found him there, crying over his telegraph key. Without words, the young man sat beside the old operator and began tapping out a message. "CQ, CQ, CQ. This is Walter Kowalski's apprentice. We're still here. We're still listening. We remember." 5 years after the lights went out, Walter Kowalski sat in his basement workshop, but he was no longer alone. The space had been transformed into a training center where a new generation learned the old ways. Tyler Bradley, now 22 and a certified emergency coordinator, taught Morse code to children who'd never known a world with reliable electricity. The electromagnetic pulse had never been reversed. Too much infrastructure was simply gone forever. But humanity had adapted, as it always does. The amateur radio network had become the nervous system of a slower, more deliberate civilization. Communities that had learned to value knowledge over convenience, connection over consumption. Sophie Henderson, now 13 and healthy, served as the youngest licensed amateur radio operator in the state. Her call sign, W2SRV, Whiskey 2 Survivor, crackled across the airwaves every evening as she coordinated homework help between isolated rural schools. Walter's workshop walls were covered with QSL cards, confirmation postcards from radio contacts around the world. Each card represented a moment when human voices had reached across the darkness, when ancient skills had proved their worth again. From Australian cattle stations to Norwegian fishing villages, the network continued growing. On quiet nights, when the static cleared and atmospheric conditions aligned perfectly, Walter could still reach Chen Weiming in Alaska, Michiko Tanaka's daughter in California, and dozens of other operators who remembered the old ways. They formed a living bridge between the world that was lost and the world being built. The last entry in Walter's logbook, written in his careful handwriting, read, "The future isn't about the technology we build, it's about the knowledge we preserve. Every skill we think is obsolete, every connection we think is outdated, might be exactly what saves us when everything else fails. Stay vigilant. Keep listening. Never stop learning." As winter snow began falling outside his farmhouse, Walter Kowalski adjusted his headphones and reached for the brass telegraph key. Somewhere in the electromagnetic wilderness, other voices were calling. And he would answer, as he always had, as he always would. Dit-dut-it, dit-dut-it, dit-dut-it. The signal for attention, for connection, for hope continuing across the dark. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of human resilience and forgotten wisdom. Share it with someone who appreciates both great storytelling and the timeless skills that connect us all. What obsolete knowledge do you think might save us someday? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one.